So Katie, Kyle, and I all arrived at experiential graphic design in different ways, but we all felt, it's something that we all really enjoy, and it's a field that back when we were in school, we felt like we wish we had had somebody telling us more about it, because I think we would have maybe done things a little differently. I know I would have. And I think too, with experiential graphic design, it's not strictly like traditional graphic design. It's something that's really runs the gamut between sort of sculpture and digital and graphic, like traditional graphic design. But it's something that encompasses all these different fields and is a really good opportunity for people who are not graphic design majors to maybe see opportunities that they may not have originally thought of, as well as graphic design majors to realize there's this area of graphic design that's really exciting that they may not have necessarily been thinking of as a career path. So we're going to give an overview about experiential graphic design, talk about our career paths and our work, and then share. Katie and Kyle are going to go over a case study together that they recently worked on that shows a project from concept to installation. So they can show the process of concept development all the way through the collaboration with the fabricator to the installation and the finished product. And we're also going to tell you, Katie and I are both, as Winslow mentioned, we're both co-chairs for the Society for Experiential Graphic Design for the Boston chapter. And so we'll tell you a little bit about that because it's an organization where we welcome students and student members and student groups. It's just a really wonderful design community to be a part of. And we'll leave some time for questions at the end. So experiential graphic design encompasses all these different ways of thinking and all these different industries where you end up collaborating with architects, interior designers, fabricators, digital content designers, branding consultants. So it's something where you're constantly collaborating with all these different disciplines. And as far as the Society of Experiential Graphic Design goes, we welcome all these different disciplines and these professions. But in addition to that, in addition to professional practicing designers, we also welcome students, like I was saying before. And it's just really fun because they're just constantly introduced to new ways of thinking because you're always collaborating with people with different backgrounds, but still have a design mindset. And so what is experiential graphic design encompasses all these different elements, including digital experiences. I'm showing here. Exhibition design, which really includes a lot of the digital experiences from the last slide, but also includes elements like, thinking along the lines of sculpture, how this light fixture relates to this wall, like this undulating wall texture. And we're working with lighting designers, digital designers, fabricators. So there's all these different elements that go into it. And then more sort of traditional two-dimensional graphics, but thinking of those graphics in a three-dimensional way where you're using all these different planes and thinking of how they interact with each other, like how this stair almost acts as like a wayfinding element to lead you up to maybe the next part of the exhibit, or how the floor interacts with the wall graphics, or how this messaging leads you around the space. And the goal of it is connecting people to place. That's really what our job is. And we're always thinking about, creative ways that we can approach it through interactive experiences. Katie and my experience is strongly in placemaking and identity projects, whether it be through corporate offices, universities, organizations, where you're basically taking a brand and infusing it into a space, but thinking of it from all these different different points of view, where you're thinking of different materials and how those materials relate to the brand, the scale of the typography in relation to somebody walking through the space and their perspective of it. So it's a lot of fun because as somebody who started out in graphic design in a more traditional print setting, it's really fun to get to use all these different materials. Public installations, wayfinding, which is what a lot of people think of when they think of experiential graphic design, signage and wayfinding through an airport or a park or museum. both the physical signage structures all the way to the digital components that you can connect to your phone, so it helps you through the space more easily and it's more accessible. So my career has been sort of all over the place. I graduated UMass Dartmouth with a degree in graphic design, and they called it letterform at the time, which is kind of antiquated, but it sounds kind of neat actually, because I love typography. I graduated in 2004, and then my focus was really on working in-house at higher ed and nonprofit organizations. And I also worked at, working in-house had its perks, but I also found that I ended up getting sort of sick of working with within the same brand all the time, over and over and over again. I really wanted to be creating new brands. So I started working at graphic design studios, both full-time and freelance, and then eventually led to an opportunity to work at Flanders and Associates, which is an environmental or experiential graphic design firm in Boston. And I was really fortunate, because something that I want to stress as we're showing you our work and our experiences, when I started at Flanders, I was in my early 30s and I had no EGD experience at all. And what drove the principal of the firm to want to hire me was my use of typography and pattern and color. So it's really those like fundamental graphic design elements that are still really important. It's not about learning how to do detail drawings and knowing how to build something and knowing how to mount signage to something, because that's stuff that comes later. So I want to stress that as we're going through this, don't feel like you all of a sudden have to learn all this stuff. It's something that you'll learn it with time, and if you have a strong interest in it, it's a matter of pursuing firms that they see your talent and your potential. So after Flanders and Associates, I realized I wanted to focus on this full time. So I worked at Sasaki Associates, which is a 300-person architecture and design firm just west of Boston, for about 3 years, and then worked as a senior designer at Arrow Street afterwards, because I really wanted to be in the city. I just felt like it was nice to be more involved in the design community there. I had an opportunity to start a graphic design team at Dyer Brown Architects, right around the corner from Arrow Street. And I was just thinking today, it marks a year since I actually started working there, but then the pandemic hit, and I got laid off back in July. But I've sort of seen it as an opportunity to, as crazy as it sounds, because it can be kind of scary, but I've worked for myself before, so I've decided to sort of take the reins and see where it leads. So I've been working independently since then, and then also working Kayte and I are co-chairing SCGD Boston chapter. So my work, when I started out at Flanders, she was really excited about my pattern design work. And so one of my first projects involved me photographing architectural details and then making patterns out of them. And for me, it was really the first time I was introduced to all the different ways that you could work with something as simple as vinyl, or like a window cling vinyl, where you can print, spot printed or like overall print. So you could see through it and create this really interesting environment where people could walk up to the windows and look through, or they could just stand back and enjoy like the whole series of the 30 window graphics that we did. It was an interesting project because I didn't know what was going in. We weren't allowed to actually know who the tenant was going to be, because it was sort of it was in transition, and people thought that based on the graphics that it was going to be like an art museum or something, which was definitely exciting, but it turned out to be a Walgreens, which wasn't nearly as interesting, but it was still a very fun project and just a really great way to be introduced to EGD. So I also worked, when I was at Sasaki, we did a lot of brand identity and signage and environmental graphics. So it was nice because we took projects really from the bare bones of creating a brand all the way through signage and wayfinding and experiential graphics. And one of the projects I worked on was developing a pattern design that was part of brand identity that was then used in all aspects of the signage and even a custom crosswalk pattern, which was really neat because that's just not something I ever expected to be doing back when I graduated college, but definitely unexpected and a lot of fun. I was also really lucky because our other co-chair, Sam Pease, was my boss at the time. And since I had no understanding of signage drawings and how to do detailed drawings, he was really helpful because he came from a fabrication background and taught me how to, you know, look at things in elevation and plan views and how to mount things. And again, that knowledge comes with time, and it's something you're constantly learning about. And even in some cases, the durability or, you know, the limitations of the materials are changing. So it's something that you have a really good relationship with a fabricator. They're always going to make you aware of those sorts of things. We also worked on brand identity design for the Society for Arts and Crafts, as well as this custom faceted sculpture or canopy sculpture that went above the entryway. And that was a really fun process because it wasn't just me developing a pattern for it. I was working with an architect to develop this faceted form, and then a structural engineer at the fabricator to make sure that, you know, this wouldn't come crashing down on anybody, and then lighting to you know, make sure that this stood out at night. So it was custom LEDs so that they could change it to whatever colors they wanted, all the way to things like as simple as code signage, where we did our own little personal touches on it because it's an arts organization. I also really enjoy doing work for parks, and this was a park over in Fort Point area in Boston. And again, like going back to like thinking about the limitations of the materials you're working with, you know, when you feel really strongly about typography and you want to make sure serifs come out looking right, when you're sandblasting into concrete, it's something where you have to do a bunch of tests to make sure that as you're doing it, it ends up reading correctly. You know, you don't want rounded corners in places where they're supposed to be, you know, 90-degree angles. So a really fun project to think of, like how we're telling a story in the space of, in this case, it was telling the history of the Boston Wolfe Company over a series of benches, and then hiring a mosaic artist to develop a custom mosaic pattern for the bench in the middle, and a map that shows how the area transitioned over time. I have a really strong interest in type, and while none of these are all more personal projects, they're things that I'd really like to start doing more of, where it's more like placemaking. I would love to, this was a sculpture that I worked on, but I really love the idea of taking something like this and making it 20 feet tall and having people walk in and out of it. And again, I love patterns, so it's something that I end up taking typography and sort of integrating those two things. This was a recent project that I did it before leaving Aerostrait, where it's a kiosk design as you're leaving Revere, the Wonderland T station. So the sort of things that we get involved in is like we'll work on SketchUp models of a space so that the client has a really strong understanding of what it's going to look like, where it's going to be. And in some cases, if you know the programs well enough, you can render them so that the materials even reflect that as well. And in this case, it's actually in production, so it should be going in, I'm guessing, in the spring at this point. But it was really fun to be able to think of something more sculptural, and I would really love to do that more. I've thought of going back to school for sculpture, just because I feel like it would really help me in that way of thinking. And I threw this in just because this is sort of a good example of a fun collaboration with an interior designer, where we were developing graphics for a school, but I wanted to work with the interior design team to make sure that the graphics that we were thinking of, they're all derived from natural and historical and industrial elements in the town that the school was going in. So we wanted to make sure that those graphics were something that translated as tile and flooring and any other materials we were using, because you could very well or very easily pick out colors that don't actually exist in actual tile, or maybe the tile is really expensive and you have to pick another color. So it's just a fun way to like create a board when we were in the process of developing the concepts to look at all the elements that are coming together. So I'm going to hand it off to Kayte to talk about. her experience.
Thank you. Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Good?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having us. It's very exciting to, just open everyone's eyes to another way to think about your career. SEGD talks about us being kind of design misfits, and for some reason that title resonates because there's no set path, and my path and Jessica's are, very different. I actually, went from school to staying in one firm for a very long period of time. But I very early had an interest in high school in just three-dimensional things. I was thinking, what do I want to be when I grow up? Do I want to be an architect? I started to learn about industrial design, and I actually went and looked for schools that had industrial design as a major. So Syracuse was one of those, and I went there thinking I would do industrial design, but then communication design caught my eye, which is really at its foundation graphic design, but thinking about it in more of a conceptual basis. So the program there really taught me the basics of how to think conceptually and how to communicate messages through any types of design, and really became a good primer for what I did throughout my career. So I went to SGA, which is an architecture firm, and I was our in-house graphic designer. I worked on things like proposals and advertising graphics, things for the website. I would do PowerPoints all day long for the architecture and interior design teams. And then we started to see an opportunity to take graphic design and help clients tell their story of their brand through that as a service. So I was there for 16 years, and my job kind of changed and evolved from being a communication designer to then leading a team of designers. And I had the pleasure of, helping other design misfits learn that they could also participate in the field. And then just before I left, I was really focused even more on the business side of things. As design director, I was working on bringing in new clients and, thinking of how to grow the team and things like that. So in that period of time, my role changed enough that I gained some really great experience and great opportunities and worked with some great clients that I'll share with you. Also during that time, I became co-chair of the Boston SEGD chapter, which I'm obviously still doing. And then I left to do my own design consulting work in 2019. And then I began teaching at Stonehill College a couple of graphic design courses. So I'm still doing that, and that's been another fun way to meet with students and let more and more students know that if you're interested in graphic design, you might also be interested in experiential graphic design. So I'll take you through, thanks, Jessica, a few slides of my work. We started out, most of my work focused at SGA focused on corporate clients, although this project here was for Wentworth Institute of Technology. The architecture team was redesigning their student center, and we had all these great opportunities for bringing experiential graphics throughout the space, particularly in the main social areas of the space. And as I mentioned, I love that we can use graphics to tell stories. And some of the images that you see here, particularly the red tower and the gray image below that, actually have images in the background that are the old and new architectural drawings of the building. So if you're walking up a stairway, you might actually see a stair detail near it that was the original drawing for that stair, or there's lots of ways to hide interesting pieces and parts of the story. On the left of this slide, you're actually seeing some print design that we did for them to help with touring of the space after we designed it. So that was a nice, well-rounded project where we were thinking about the space, and then we were also able to put together some marketing materials for them. The next project was for a corporate client. Their name was CommuniSpace, now they're CSpace. They're kind of a PR firm. And this project was all about not just the brand, but the culture of the space. So we did a lot of learning about what were the employees like, what was their day-to-day like, how did the CEO want to tell the story. And we did some fun things. They had asked us to display 500 employee photos within the space. And we quickly realized there wasn't enough wall space to do that. So the image in the upper left shows a video screen with the faces of all the employees scrolling across. There was a lot of care and thought that was put into that, not only from an architecture standpoint of how it would look, but also on the back end of how they manage all the employee photos and update them. We also brought some food and fun things in. We themed different pantries after different snacks that they would enjoy. There's a middle image at the top that has like giant Twizzlers and goldfish and different snack items. And then what's not pictured here is one thing that was really important to their culture was hosting outside events, and they always had them in their previous space in an area they called Fenway Park. The old space, Fenway Park, was just a green wall that they called the Green Monster. But in their new space, their whole entire cafeteria became Fenway. We had signage and different elements in that space, stadium seating and different things to, again, reflect the culture of the space. And we also provided some print pieces for tours and different, to house different facts about the space as people were touring through. The next project, if you want to go ahead, or the next slide, is actually a collection of projects that I wanted to share, again, focusing kind of on storytelling and how we've weaved different things into the space. So the first image on the left is the headquarters for Car Gurus. If anyone's done any car shopping, they're a great website or app. They actually help you determine if you're getting a great price. But we wanted to bring some fun into their space. They basically said, we don't have a brand. We have a logo that we use on our website. That's it. What can we do? And we decided to use car parts and artifacts to really infuse the space with some fun. So you're seeing there's a license plate wall on the left that has a few custom license plates with hidden messages. There's also a series of conduit and car part mirrors that weave through the rest of this cafeteria space that you're seeing to really represent the network or the searching capabilities of their company through something dimensional and fun within the space. The image on the upper right with the red glass is for a tech company that was all about decoding information. So at their pantries, we installed wall coverings with hidden messages that you can actually see through the red glass, which was a really fun way to create some type of surprise in the space. The CEO was really big on having people move into the space and discover different things as they enjoyed the space. And this was one of those opportunities. In the lower images on the lower left, this was a project we actually did 2 spaces for Log Me In. They're growing like crazy, but they do a lot with remote technology. So I'm sure they're helping lots of folks in this situation with the pandemic. The story for them was about how global their offices were, and they were moving into a 6-story space. So every floor was themed after a different country that they had an office in. Things like pantries, we played up, food that was likened to that place. And then on the brick, we actually worked with a painter to come in and whitewash some graffiti graphics to, again, link back to all those places. So this was for their Wichita, Kansas office with the corn. And the last image on this space was for Monotype. So Jessica would love this as well. So being into typography, to work with Monotype was like a dream come true. They actually have an office right outside of Boston in Woburn. And we pushed typography to the limits. You can't quite get a photo of exactly all the things that are going on in this image in the lower right, but we brought in things like the ceiling is shaped like what we call the comma apostrophe. There's elements of the floor and walls that are like the stroke of an O. We have the letter T depressed into the wall to house some technology. They let us do a lot with type and letter forms and cropping. And the wall behind the woman at the reception desk is actually, I think it's over 100 letter forms in the shape of an M, all different, every type style that they had. It's actually backlit with color changing lighting so that we were able to bring in a dynamic kind of kinetic element into that space. I wish I had a GIF or a movie file to show a little bit more of that. And then on the last slide, there's another collection. So you'll actually see in the lower right that Get In and Go image is also from Log Me In. where we were theming the floors after different countries. So when you would get off the elevator, you would be greeted with an icon and a different shade of a color to help you understand that you're moving up and down through the space. This was actually located adjacent to those pantries that I had shown you to further pull those themes throughout the floors. And then I have on the left, 2 duck themed projects, different clients. The top one, this client let us have a lot of fun with perceptual graphics and also just perspectives. So this is a long, narrow corridor that we wanted to enliven. And we brought in a series of sculptural fins. And on one side, the fins, as you can see here, complete part of their logo. You can see the shape of a duck. When you return the opposite way in the corridor, there's actually a series of squares that are color-coded to create binary code that also spells their name. So that was a fun way to actually display client names and logos in a coded fashion. And then the bottom ducks, a different interpretation on code, because this was also important to this client. We were walking through their existing space. It was a mess. They did not want us to see their space. They were embarrassed, but we noticed they had black rubber duckies everywhere. And so we're like, what's the story with the ducks? We noticed they were positioned strategically sideways and forward facing. And the software engineers were actually positioning them in binary code. So if the duck was facing you, it represented a 1. If it was sideways, it was a 0. So they were giving messages to each other. So in their new space, which you see pictured here, we created a shelving system with graphics and some other material changes to house these ducks. So I don't know if any other duck clients will come my way, but I've had a fair share of those. I think we're going to turn it over to Kyle now.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for having me. I think what Kayte made the point of about being design misfits is really true. Through my career, every place I've worked in the signage world, we always sort of refer to ourselves as the island of misfit toys, which is just so fitting that the design misfit, is also used. The path to get here is really, everyone is so different. And if you ever get a chance to work at a fabrication sign shop or a design studio, you'll see that there really is no direct path. My path started off with the being creative and wanting to build. So Hartford Art School is where I learned how to sculpt, but I really was an introduction to materials and material handling. I learned to weld, I learned to cast, I learned just really all the basics of sculpture. And then graduating with the BFA in sculpture, no one really tells you what you can do with that degree while you're spending 4 years building up debt. Luckily, as I was bartending, one of the managers at the restaurant knew somebody who worked at a studio that did prototypes for the toy industry. And that is where that opened my eyes to industrial design. I worked for a couple years doing prototypes for Toy Biz and Coleco. There's a whole bunch of different studios that came to us. After doing that for a couple years, I decided I needed to get my master's in industrial design, that there really just wasn't anything I could do with the BFA in sculpture. The roads were paved in gold at that time. It was 1999. San Francisco seemed like the place to go. I moved out west. While I was there, I worked for a few years building architectural models and also being a machinist, always wanting to take the knowledge I had prior from a material standpoint, what I learned from my BFA in sculpture and being able to apply that. While I was working full-time, I got my master's in industrial design, and I have a couple projects from my master's degree that I wanted to talk about, just really talking about how I learned different materials, how to manipulate, and also really just the critical design thinking you get when you get your degree in industrial design, how to ask the right questions, how to narrow down exactly what the end result is going to be through that critical thinking. So the first project was my graduate thesis. If you want to go next, Jess.
Yep, hold on.
Okay.
It's thinking about it. There we go.
So this was at the time, Bluetooth was really just a brand new thing. Wanting to, and this is before really everyone had Bluetooth speakers around their house. Everyone, as far as I knew, had surround sound stereos or the big speakers in the room. And the idea behind this project was to have sound in the house that wasn't the focal point or center of attention while in a space. That you typically walk into someone's apartment and they'd have a TV with the stereo and the speakers, and it really forced you to sit and use the space a certain way. My idea was having sound be integrated into lighting that would be more ambient in nature throughout the space, so that the sound could become part of the space and that you then chose how you lived within the environment. So from just a product standpoint, I learned how to sew. I was able to learn or teach myself different techniques on the table saw, different fabrication techniques, learned a lot about Bluetooth protocol and how to incorporate technology. But it was a fun project that really allowed me to utilize a lot of what I'd learned prior and what I'd learned in grad school. The next project was a project we worked on in grad school with Nike, developing different eyewear. So what you see there was all sculpted by me. So that was something that my bachelor's in sculpture helped, is being able to hand manipulate materials. Most of that was made with acrylic and, believe it or not, crazy glue. If anyone here has ever really worked with crazy glue as a medium, which probably very few people have, you could use an accelerator with the glue. So you could build it up and accelerate it and build up material that way, prime it, sand it, and really shape it. But that was fun, working with Nike, having design briefs with them, going up to Oregon, meeting with their teams. And that was something I was able to build while also going through grad school. So I made a lot of people jealous that I had a fabrication studio at my disposal while in grad school. The next project, so that's a project, I was co-teaching a class while I was in grad school about materials and methods. And so that was an assignment we had the students do, and it was all about developing a product that could be flat packed and focusing on a manufacturing method. So for this, everything was made on a laser cutter, designed to be assembled by hand. That inner shade was thin polyethylene that could be folded together and slid down the core once the lamp was assembled. But that was a fun project because it sort of pulled off of being a sculptor, as well as took some industrial elements, focusing on manufacturing methods, to create something that was three-dimensional. The next slide is just some of the work I did while, I guess, feeding myself through grad school as a model maker. So that was a really interesting job because we were able to, or we had to take the designs from the architects. And if anyone's ever seen a set of blueprints, there's 1,000 lines in any given inch of the drawing. We had to delete everything that wasn't important, keeping just what you would see at scale. So my job was, going elevation by elevation, breaking out the individual components of a building, deleting all the extraneous lines. Again, the things that you would see in scale, the things that you wouldn't, figuring out how you would laser cut and assemble and build. Also taking all the colors. So we would get actual marble samples from the client, stone samples. How does that relate in scale? How does that translate when you're in an airplane looking at something from 2,000 feet, which was sort of the point of view you had to take, and then figuring out what that color would be. All the colors were hand mixed. The building on the upper left, like that tan color, was a base color with 3 different oversprays, all to give you that feel of that limestone that was on the building facade. So it was being a model maker taught me so much that will transition to what I do today in the signage world, being able to understand color, understand scale, and material. The next slide was a prototype we built. So while I was in grad school, there was a program that was being done in conjunction with our grad school and this company that was out of Massachusetts called Reveal for a CT scanner. This is right after 9/11. Luggage security and scanning was a big thing. Reveal had developed a compact CT scanner. I was able to get the contract for building the prototype that went to trade shows, and then they actually then built some units that were put around the world. So, but that was fun, trying to build something, you know, full size in scale that you could interact with as well. There was a touch screen display that had the same sort of graphic user interface that the real one would have, sort of as a video. The next one. So this is, again, kind of falling back on my sculpting background, but there was a project, independent study in grad school. Myself and a friend of mine who was a guitar player, he came to me and said, you know, it would be great having a travel guitar that was made out of composites that wouldn't be affected with moisture, humidity. If anyone here is an instrument player, you'll know that with wood instruments, right, they breathe, they move, they change. So we sought out to develop something that you could essentially use as an oar if you're backpacking and canoeing, and that wouldn't get destroyed by being wet. So that form was all hand sculpted, hand carved. I was able to teach myself composites and carbon fiber work. So that was the prototype we developed. So from a business standpoint, this really utilized everything I'd previously learned, but then we took it the next step. We got a booth at the National Association of Music Makers Festival. There was, and everyone was there. All the major guitar manufacturers were coming to check out the new guy in town. And we had this tiny booth in the basement, but the people from Martin, the people from Rainsong, Taylor, they all wanted to come down and play the guitar. And so I, at that time, was finishing grad school and moving back to the East Coast. I sold my portion of it to my partner, who has since been doing this now for the last 15 or so years and has all different models and whatnot. And next. So just some photos we got published. It was, it was really my first time being kind of a grown-up, feeling like what I was doing mattered. Next. So we're going to transition a bit to going outside of architectural model making, outside of grad school, my introduction to the sign world. I just graduated, moved back from California to the East Coast, and got a job at Design Communications as a design engineer. I had applied there for a fabrication position because I had been a fabricator for so many years. They saw my portfolio and my degree, and they said, we want to hire you, but as a design engineer, which was pretty frightening because I was not an engineer. And so there was a fairly steep learning curve for me to figure things out. This was one of the earlier projects I worked on. It's a 28-foot tall fiberglass reinforced translucent green Coke bottle. Having experience with carbon fiber and sculpting, they put me on this project to not only work on the drawings, but the rigging, but manage the fabrication, oversee the people who were sculpting the segments and the people that were doing the fiberglass work. And to the next slide, you could see some more images of it installed, and that's me inside rigging it. So the interesting challenge for this project was both how it gets transported to the site from the Northeast to Atlanta. It gets transported sideways to then its final place, it's vertical. Both have different loads, and having to calculate the rigging for transport under a dynamic load in a horizontal configuration versus a vertical configuration and a static load. I worked with an engineer to come up with the layout for all the cables, and lucky me, got to climb inside on a hot day in New Hampshire, drill through fiberglass, which if you've ever done is itchy, and assemble all the cables. But being hands-on, that really came in handy. Next. All right, so the next slide, just it's just something really simple. I was using AutoCAD back at DCL, just being able to do some 3D to show exactly how everything looked and functioned. Sort of that bottom front orthographic is just a sort of a basic idea of communicating, what goes into something. But clearly this drawing would have had multiple pages and multiple sections, speccing material and methods. And next. So kind of back to the whole rigging thing. So we had this project over at Southfield. It was a marketing center. The designer, Kevin Burke, wanted these panels to all be suspended in space using aircraft cables. So lucky me, I had some experience with that. Sort of the lower portion of that slide just shows some sketches where I was working out hardware, how things were going to come together, what the components were going to be. Sketching is such an important tool that if you're ever going to do anything building, being able to sketch and communicate, even if it's just for yourself. They don't have to be the prettiest drawings in the world, but they can communicate so much your intent and just how you're going to process and do things. So I was able to find hardware that was off the shelf and then figuring out what pieces, what aluminum extrusions I could use that was a standard extrusion, how that could be cut up and utilized, and all those pieces went together. When I was at DCL, most of what I did started off in sketch form and then would go to AutoCAD. So much faster to iterate with a pen or pencil than just jumping right into the design software. Next. So just a cabinet, right? It seems really simple. And this is what is really interesting about what we do in the sign world is designers don't want to see hardware, right? They don't want to see screws. They don't want to see seams. They want everything to look like it was born the way they've envisioned. These particular elements needed to be movable, if you will, but fixed in place so they couldn't fall. So you could see at the very bottom of these, they have these sleeves that cover the feet. This unit was held between the soffit and the floor in compression by having adjustable feet underneath. So those covers could slide up. You would adjust the feet. It would tension it between the soffit and the floor. The covers would slide back down. But then there's also technology built inside. The right-hand image shows that the screen's turned off, but how do you get power into it, right? That came in through the soffit. How do you access that if the IT people have to service it? So developed a way that all the hardware was invisible. You would reach underneath, undo some thumb screws, and a side panel was held on with upside down Z-clips. So what we do is really figuring out, it's almost magic, what the designer wants and how it could be done. Because being also a designer and working with a lot of designers don't understand really how things are going to get built. They have this vision of what they want, but they're not sure how to achieve that. But then you have to put your design engineer hat on and figure out all those pieces, all those components. And then you have to do so in a way that is not going to cost too much money as well. Next slide. So again, just some sketches. So I was working with, these sketches were all from the MGM Grand project down at Foxwoods. I was the design engineer on the entire signage package, and I was working closely with the owner of the company of DCL, who really likes sketching and communicating that way. So, figuring out sort of how everything's going to work, the exploded view, notes. I was able to sit with him and communicate ideas on paper prior to going into AutoCAD. And the next slide shows some of the finished work. So everything that you see that was in finished view here had sketches that associated it, that talked about what materials, what methods, if it's welded, if it's screwed, if it's riveted. And where I learned how to do all that stuff was just staying creative, always looking. So like when we had a slow day at DCL, I would read the McMaster car catalog, and I really love hardware. I really love materials. And so having that in the back of your head, so when someone comes to me and says, I want to do this, I know if hardware exists. I know by being a materials nerd, what materials are good in what environments, what typical sizes material comes in. So if a designer comes to me with something that's 6 feet by 12 feet, I could tell them that's an oversized sheet. It's really expensive. It's hard to find it, and try to work in seams or figure something else out, because cost is always a factor. And now that I'm in sales, that's my job, is figuring out what things are going to cost, and kind of using all of the years of experience I have in building things to help come up with that. And next, Kayte is going to be showing you the project Affinivax that I worked on with her. And I could add a little bit about, after she designed it, how I came on board to figure out how things were going to get built and how to price it.
So raise your hand if you're feeling inspired and want to climb inside a Coke bottle. I'll raise my hand and admit that I have to call Kyle when I want things to look like they don't have seams, and we have to figure out ways to get around that. The Affinivax project, we're just going to take you very quickly through the design process, how I get started, when I'm interacting with the fabrication team. I always try to get them in as early as possible. So we'll kind of talk through that, and then obviously answer any questions that you have. But we always start with a discovery phase, and some of these parts will probably look similar to ways that you're starting projects and design processes that you're beginning to practice or that you might have already developed on your own. I always start with, because I'm the storytelling lady, I come in with lots of questions. I want to know for my clients to describe their business, who's their target audience, what are the key messages, do they have brand standards in place or anything in place that we have to coordinate with. If I'm working with an architecture team, they already have renderings or drawings or plans, I'm looking at those. And it's simple things that clients will say, not realizing that they're giving you that little nugget of inspiration or a spark that I'm looking for early in that phase. So this is a slide that I actually used with our client Affinivax, and they are actually a vaccination company. Who knew I'd be working with a vaccination company? After my first meeting with the client, we went into the stay-at-home orders, and we did all of our meetings remote. They do a different vaccine, but it was just an interesting alignment with what was going on in the world. So we go through these series of questions, and for this client, it was really about how simple their science is and how elegant. They use the word elegant a lot to talk about the crystal structures. And I tell them, I'm in kindergarten. You're going to have to, describe your science as if, I know nothing. So they are walking me through this. They also explain that their employees were very important to the story. Their science started at Boston Children's Hospital. And also the level of impact to remind employees that they're actually impacting the world with the work that they do in the labs. So we can go to the next slide. Also as part of discovery, so I'm learning about the stories and the messages and the meaning behind what we want to convey with the space. I'm also working with the architect to understand, at this stage, they had floor plans in place and renderings. So in the kind of upper right, you can see sort of blurry, but the word enter, you enter into the space off of the elevators. You're in kind of an open lobby space. There's no reception desk, but then immediately to the left where you see the number 2 is this main corridor that they really wanted to focus our attention on and activate to connect people from the lobby to a major cafe space at the bottom of the floor plan. So this is the stage where I'm asking questions about what is the architecture doing? What is the finish palette? How do people move through the space? Who is sitting where? What will the path be for visitors? And kind of discovering, what the space itself will feel like, understanding ceiling heights, lighting, what are the givens in the space? For this project, this was all being designed, so I couldn't go visit the space. I could look at the renderings. Other projects, sometimes you're working with an existing space that you would tour. So if you go to the next slide, then as part of discovery, I'm starting to pull inspiration images, think about what materials or printing methods or patterns or typography would start to align with this project. You can kind of see the left grouping are resources from the client. So this is their logo. They have somewhat strong and fixed brand colors, but they weren't set on really using those throughout the space. They wanted kind of a neutral palette. Some people images, these are the scientists that actually are leading the charge over there. They also shared with me some of the scientific images. And then on the right are images that I pulled for inspiration throughout the project. So the next 3 slides kind of go through what we would call conceptual design, or in architecture field, schematic design. But this is when you're thinking of as many ideas as possible. You're hand sketching, you're starting to draw things on the computer. At this stage, I'm thinking through what's the sequence of the story. So this drawing that you see at the top is actually a representation of the corridor, where people will be passing from the lobby on the right all the way to the cafe on the left. And I had to make some decisions about how am I going to draw this so the client understands. You'd never actually see this wall in one fell swoop, but I wanted them to understand how the design was piecing together. So I almost had to educate them on how we're going to look and evaluate the design and then give them different ideas. This idea contemplated fins for the architecture. On the next slide, Jessica knows right where I'm headed. On the next slide, we contemplated the walls returning to create these kind of angular features to move people through the space. This feature would also allow for people from the lobby, again, coming from the right, to have one vantage point, and people coming from the cafe to have a different vantage point. And then on the next slide is looking at the different ways of the architecture, but also, challenging them to ask questions about the story. Do we want to start with the science first, or do we want to start with the idea that you're global first? So this one's starting to look more at science, and you see these kind of particles moving along throughout the space. So if you go to the next slide, the client now weighs in and says, okay, we really want, when people come in from the lobby, for this to be a global message. We want people that are leaving the cafe from the left to be reminded of the impact that they're having. And they start to give you this feedback so you can help them settle their ideas into the right sequence for the story. So this slide is actually showing at the top, going from conceptual design, getting a little bit closer in terms of materials, in terms of settling down that we're going to have a map starting. As you experience the space, we're going to start to bring in some line work to represent this continuous thread that they have through the globe. And then in the middle drawing, you're starting to see a little more definition come into that piece. We're moving messages around and separating ideas to get something that looks simple, but is saying a lot of things at one time. And then the bottom drawing, because this is such an iterative process, we're now coming in and saying, okay, we've committed to the map. Here's how we'll illustrate the map. We've committed to the line drawing. Let me draw the line, the actual drawing for you so you can approve that. And then you're actually seeing on the left and right a sculptural piece that I'm sure Kyle will be able to chime in on how this was created. But this was a piece that was heavy on sculpture, different thicknesses of wood, also printing, to really bring in a custom art piece to flank the space. So we can go to the next slide. Kind of flying through, but once you have your client's approval on the overall design and all of the content, you can then start to put together what we would call design intent drawings. This is when you're developing the design. So you're saying, okay, the wood wall covering that we want to use, let's choose the wood wall covering. Here's the actual wood wall covering. We said the lettering was going to be brown. Let's choose the brown color that it will actually be. So you're starting to specify things and get very specific with your choices. You're applying dimensions to things, so that a wonderful fabricator like Kyle and his team can put some pricing to this, and the client can react to the pricing to make sure they can afford what you want to do. This is where sometimes you experience some back and forth. Maybe we need to remove some scope, or maybe we need to build something in a more efficient way. It really depends on the project. But now you're looking at all of the components of this particular project. So we're looking at the whole corridor and all the graphics that are wrapping the walls. We're looking at installing a logo at the front door, graphic film on a lot of the conference rooms and meeting spaces. And then we're also looking at what Jessica had mentioned earlier, what we would traditionally think of as environmental graphics. We're looking at the signage. So projects can have these multiple layers. It's important that all of your material choices, typography, pattern, texture can all work together, not only with the graphics and the experiential pieces, but also the architecture that they're being installed into. So one more slide on process. What I have here are just some close-ups of what we call production artwork. So this is the artwork that the graphic designer develops, delivers to the fabrication team so that they can print or cut or, a million different things to create your work. So this is when you need to be really strategic about what types of files are you creating? Is it vector? Is it raster? Am I using Illustrator or Photoshop? And you kind of pull your design apart in layers. So at the top here, we have the line art piece that was created. This was something that I started with hand traces on 8.5 by 11 sheets, brought into the computer, created as vector, and now it's a 44-foot long installation. And that's cut vinyl. So I worked with Kyle and his team to understand how thin can I get that line, because I wanted it as thin as possible, of course. I'm also delivering files that show all of the hexagons that create the map. There's over 7,000 hexagons that create the map with tiles laid over those. And then I'm also taking the client's scientific imagery, manipulating that in Photoshop, changing the colors, and delivering that in very high fidelity files. So Kyle, I don't know if you want to jump in here, or the next slide shows the installation photos.
We could go to the next one because that shows the finished product. So as Kayte mentioned, so the design intent is really the document that I get that helps drive what the project is going to be from a cost standpoint, as well as a how the heck are you going to do it standpoint. So when I break things out, I break it out sign type by sign type, in my proposal being as descriptive as possible. So that way, when Kayte and the team are reviewing it, they can really see how I'm thinking what my approach is going to be. When Kayte came to me, that line art was, she was thinking about that as being masked and painted. And yes, we could mask and paint it, absolutely. But mask and paint poses a lot of challenges. Well, what I've been finding too, just from a fabrication standpoint, in the built space with low VOC paints, is the adhesion between the paint and the wall, for whatever reason, in the last 10 years, has been poor. So if I were to mask and paint this, I'm going to have to cut a vinyl mask that gets applied essentially to the entire surface of the wall. Then I have to take the exact color paint that the wall is painted in and seal those edges. Then I need to paint the real color. Then I need to peel that paint mask off and hope to God I don't pull any of the existing paint off underneath it. Even though it's a lower tack a product, the space was painted probably a week or two prior to us getting in there. So, things really aren't fully cured. So when I looked at that, yes, I could mask and paint it, but it's going to be expensive because I have to cover the cost of redoing things and touching up and versus the vinyl. And I was able to convince Kayte that we could do it out of vinyl, that the seams weren't going to be an issue, that the stroke width wasn't going to be an issue. And luckily enough, I was right. So, I mean, it's really taking everything you have, almost like a chef, who knows his or her ingredients, knowing from past experience what works and what doesn't work, and putting your best guess forward. So that's just one instance there. And then the bottom left-hand hexes, it's hard to tell in this picture, but those are all different colored woods and all different thicknesses. So, how do you make something like that nests tight together, but the images bleed from one panel to the next without any shifting, right? So that means you can't put them all in the direct printer together because they're all different thicknesses. And direct printers have to have like a 1/16 inch of clearance between the print head and the material. So we developed a way to print these that we CNC cut out of some foam spots for these materials to go in, so that way when they were being printed, they were all flush at the top. But also when we were introduced to the project, team really still wasn't sure what woods they wanted. So there was a lot of kind of guessing on my part and having lots of conversations back and forth. They knew the color wood they wanted for the upper left hand for that math wall. And again, that was something that was originally specified to me as an actual wood veneer. A company makes, out of Japan, I believe, makes that product as a wood veneer, but it only comes in 10-foot long sections. So I looked at that and said, well, the space has walls greater than 10 feet. Is the design team, are they going to be okay with a horizontal seam where two grains sort of match, but they don't line up? And my guess, as Katie's shaking her head no, was that no one's going to want a horizontal seam. So, what are the alternatives? So 3M makes a product called Dynoc that comes in probably 5,000 different grains and actual textures. So it looks like wood. So understanding I can buy material on a roll that could be applied to the wall to be seamless would be, the more appropriate thing to do. And then all of those hexes, they were supposed to be printed, but instead of printing on Dynoc, we did applied hexagons. And the reason being is in the upper right-hand picture, where you can see sort of the middle tier wall, it's white with those words on it and the hexes below. All of that was supposed to be wallpaper. So the idea would be I would print the one color hex on the wood grain, but then print the other color hex on like a white background. And the hope that those two colors printed on different backgrounds would match, right? So knowing from past experience, the likelihood that those would match would be small. And then dealing with extra seams in the white wall, I had said to the team, can't we just apply those? And by doing an applied hex, it allowed us to make sure that the colors matched correctly and that there was no extra seam in that wall because it was just paint. The manufacturing method of that, I mean, it sounds daunting when I think Katie said there was like 7,000 or something hexes. It's all done in sheet, and then a little plotter knife cuts them out and you pull away or weed the extra material, apply transfer film to it for then applying. So it's not as difficult as individually mounting 7,000 hexagons. So, I mean, this job in general, I think is a really good project to share because it does encompass so much, from the ADA sign, right, which is just the room ID sign with tactile text and braille. Those weren't just a standard 6x4. They had headers. They were thicker. They had lab signs that had all sorts of different requirements, all the way through the project where the materials had to relate to one another. And so the whole thing together had to feel like one uniform project, which Katie did a great job visualizing. It's just then up to us to make sure that we carry that through and figure out manufacturing methods to make it happen. But from a pricing standpoint, I need to pull from my past experiences of running the CNC machine or applying vinyl film or being the painter and spraying I build these things in my head. When anything I'm pricing, I essentially break down all the steps, from ordering material, what is that material, what does it cost, to how does it get to the shop, how does it get processed on the CNC machine, how does it get prepped, all the individual time components that go into each step, the handling from department to department, the risks inherently involved with all of that handling, how it gets packaged and shipped to the site, all the way to when I'm on site after we were awarded the job. I had the boots on the ground. I needed to see the space. I needed to measure walls. I needed to talk to the general contractor. I needed to find out where the elevator was for me to get product in and out, what the parking situation was. I mean, you unpeel the onion and you look at all the different layers involved on top of everything that Katie put into the project. I mean, that alone is 1,000+ different options and choices. And then on top of that, you have another 1,000 questions you have to ask yourself after the fact in order to make a project like this happen. We were just lucky enough to have Katie part of the team, and the project management company was great to work with as well. And sometimes you get lucky and you get a dream team, and Other times you don't.
This is Jessica again. Winslow, I know we're running short on time, so what we're probably going to do is just skip over. We're going to give like an introduction to SEGD, but I'd really love to hear if anybody has questions, and we can send the SEGD information to you all. Also, if we're running so short on time that you'd rather us have, or people are welcome to send questions, if that's better based on your schedule, we can do that as well.
I think we have time for a few questions, definitely.
Great.
Anybody have questions?
If anyone has any.
I have a question.
Mhm.
How long do these projects usually end up going on for? Like this last project that you were describing, like how long of a time frame did that happen over?
So my first meeting was with Affinivax. Late February was when I was asking all the questions. And then I think the last installation, was it in December?
I think we did some punch list stuff yesterday.
Okay, yeah.
So yeah. Yeah, so the bulk of it was completed in December, but like any project, you're doing things for the first time in a space that's never ideal. Walls are almost never square and there's issues. So after my team is done installing, Kayte walks through and she does what's called a punch list, right? She red flags areas where maybe a print that was printed and cut, there was an alignment issue, or if something was installed and there's a scratch or whatever it might be, she creates an itemized punch list and then sends it to the project manager, and then we put together a game plan for addressing all of those. I mean, at least at Bluebird, we don't consider a job complete until the punch list is done and everyone has signed off and everyone's happy.
Yeah, there have been some projects I've worked on that have lasted years, but when you think of the longevity of the project that you're working on, and like that park that I showed you, I mean, that's still there and it's going to probably be there for maybe, hopefully, like another 20 years. So it's something where you want to make sure you get it right. And, you know, you don't want to misspell something when it's sandblasted into concrete. So it's better to and like Kyle was saying, you know, you get all these elevations where everything is, you know, perfectly angled and, you know, but in reality, you know, nothing's perfect like on site. So it's stuff that you have to navigate as part of the process. But that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
I have another one too.
Cool.
I was just wondering too, like, how do like you get like assigned these sort of projects? Like, how does one get like a park job, or like making like a little installation in a park, or compared to like in this like building that's like connecting like a cafe to another place? Like, how do you come across these?
Well, I can speak to Affinivax. So I had just started going out and doing my own independent work. And I think it was within 24 hours or maybe 48 hours, 2 separate people reached out to me saying that one was their coworker, Tom, needed somebody that did EGD. And the other one was a friend saying, my husband is project manager and needs somebody to do EGD. It ended up being the same Tom, the same project. I felt it was very serendipitous that 2 people were trying to connect me to him. So that was just through kind of word of mouth and personal relationships. Some clients will put out RFPs. In Affinivax's case on the Fabricator, I was working with the owner's project manager for the project and put together a list of fabricators I felt could work on the project. They had some suggestions as well. And Bluebird was one that I had recommended just because I was very confident in their work. So a lot of it is personal relationships. There's some projects that RFPs get listed. I don't know what was the story with the park, Jessica. Was that like a public RFP?
Yeah, that was really lucky because it was a personal relationship between MB Flanders, who's the principal, and the landscape architecture firm and the developer. So like they all knew each other really well, and they didn't send out like a request for proposal or qualifications. So we just immediately got it. So that was just a lucky. And we had a lot of really good relationships with people, like in particular the landscape architecture firm. Like we worked on the Quincy Adams Tea Station, and that's something that normally you wouldn't just get handed to, but she just had been working for or with the firm for so long that they knew they didn't want to work with anybody else. So it was pretty lucky. It doesn't normally happen.
I think a lot of it is relationships. I mean, with Bluebird, I'd say probably 2/3 of our work is through general contractors. So that work comes in through requests for proposals or requests for bid. A lot of it comes just word of mouth, like knowing Kayte and having her, speak on our behalf and getting us entered into the mix. If I didn't have a relationship with Kayte, we wouldn't have been even invited to, create a proposal. So it just really comes down to knowing people and it's just building up a good network and staying relevant.
Yeah. And I'd say too, for those of you, if you're interested in fabrication, Kyle is someone I can call and ask him a question about a project that he's not even working on.
Yes. Totally.
He's always
there.
And
that's not normal at all. So it's incredibly helpful.
You want to work with those people that you can ask questions to. And so that's a way to just, help people that they'll already know if they, have chemistry with you, like working with you, and then they'll think of you. I've also had fabricators, just call me out of the blue, check in, and it's like, oh, actually, I could actually use some help on, a ballpark price for something, or, so even just the habit of staying in touch with people just to check in is really helpful too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I offer my services to anybody, and even everybody here. If you have a question, you're not sure how to cut something, weld, paint, manipulate, purchase, whatever it might be, my email can be made available to everybody. Please just shoot me a note. I remember what it was like being younger and having questions, and luckily for you guys, Google is much faster than dial-up was back in my day, pre-Google. So I didn't have the ability to really search and find a thread somewhere and figure something out. But by all means, shoot me a note. I'm happy to help.
Did Andrea, did you have a question?
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for sharing today. It's been really informative. I just have a question about like the process, because there was so much work that you guys put into it, but then you said something about, then we had to like ask the client if they were okay with us to like actually implement what we thought was going to work out pricing wise, and like when you got the pricing. And so like what I'm curious about is, up until then, are you getting paid, or like are you charging them anything until you finally get to like, I don't know, like this just seems like a lot of work into before you actually, I don't know if that makes sense, is what I'm trying
so
to
on my part, so when a job comes out to price, we don't get paid to put together a proposal. And you hope that you win 20% or something of the work that you price, and you hope that that 20% is the work you want to do. I mean, I could have a project where I could be 60 hours into it, pricing it, and then not win it. It's tough, but that's just the name of the game for us. I imagine Kayte and Jessica, if they're pricing design work as well, I mean, they do all that for free.
Proposal writing is exhausting. And it takes a long time sometimes, because you don't want to get it wrong, or you don't want to like miss something. And that's the thing that like Kayte and I talk about a lot, because I'm, as somebody who's like on her own, like I'm still learning that. But and then if you don't get it, then you're like, oh, I just spent like Kyle was saying 60 hours or however many hours. But in terms of Kayte's work, well, if you want to talk about your process, and you got paid at least for.
Well, so yeah, there's kind of a difference, right? So if you're taking the time to put together a proposal on the design side, it's a little different than fabrication. So as a designer, if you are presented with an opportunity and you're delivering a proposal, you're going to think about what are the steps that it's going to take me to do that proposal. You'll write a scope, and then you estimate how much time you'll spend, and you present that as your fee. Once you start designing, like everything I showed you for Affinivax, that was after my proposal was approved. And then you can bill, whether it's on a monthly basis or percentage complete. So what I did for this particular project is every time I was done a phase, like if they approved the conceptual design, I would send a bill for that amount. And then when I got to the design intent drawings, I would send that, and then I would send them a bill for, okay, I'm 80% complete that part of the project. And then I think what Kyle was saying, if he's putting together a proposal or a bid, he's not really getting paid as he's putting that together. But once he's awarded the project, then you typically would get a deposit, right, for a certain amount.
It depends. So it depends on. I mean, I wish I could say yes. So Affinivax was great. We were able to put together a payment schedule where it was a certain percent down and a certain each month until complete. And then like usually 10% is held on retainage until the project is reviewed, punch list is complete. Once it's viewed as complete, that 10% would get paid. But we have projects like with the MBTA, we're doing the Green Line extension, and it's a like $2.5 million project for us in signage. And it's through multiple different general contractors. Typically, you can't bill a dime until you have something to bill. Like Katie's saying, like I can't even bill a deposit. I have to wait till shop drawings are done and approved before I could bill that portion. We could typically start billing once we order materials, but you could imagine a job that big, we might be putting out 40 grand, 50 grand in material. Then we have to document, photograph, and show receipts for that material before we could even submit a bill for material. So it depends on the project. Working for the Affinivaxes of the world is much easier. But they're smaller projects versus like a Green Line extension.
Yeah. It's good times. Emily, question?
Hi. I was just gonna ask, speaking of like budgets, I'm sure like with these projects that all the time, like as much as there might be a projected budget, like you end up going over budget, I assume, like sometimes like here and there, or more often than not, I'm sure. But I guess I wanted to know like how set in stone, like is it dependent on the project? Like sometimes is there like a very limited budget that you have to stick by, or is it like depending on the client, you can kind of like have a little bit of that like wiggle room and or do they over project what the budget should be based on like the expectation that there might be you might go over what you think you would?
I'm sure it's different on the design side. For me, my price is what my price is. I wish I was building bridges and I could just charge an extra couple billion for a bridge because I was slow in building it. For when we price work, if I say it's going to be $100,000 all in, unless there's a change order, which would be a design change or the building was built slightly different or something that comes up unforeseen, I can't charge any extra. So if I price something at $50 a piece, but my math was wrong and it should have been $500 a piece, we eat that $450 difference. So there's no pressure at all, for me when I'm putting together numbers, because if I'm not accurate, then that just eats into the profit.
Yeah.
As part of the process, like Katie was going through like concept or for architects, it's called schematic design all the way through design intent. But there's a point where you send the project out for bidding. And then that's really you're at a point where you know enough about what you want to do that you're able to get some general pricing for the project so that if it's totally just way out of scope, you can start to do something called value engineering. So you can start, maybe it's a matter of taking out a wall graphic or even like changing out materials just so that it's more affordable, or it's even something where you can talk to the client about phasing it, so it's something where maybe these are the key things that we do now and maybe down the road we do something, some of these other components.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah.
When I was working on the MGM Grand project at DCL, the client needed to save $1 million, right? I mean, the sign package was so much money that they were trying to save like $1 million. And, we had to look at what it is that they wanted to get and figure out a way to produce it so the overall feel was the same. And it kind of goes back to my days of being a model maker. What are the elements I can pull out that don't matter? What are the ones that I need to keep that do matter and overall speak to what the designer's vision was? And then doing cost comparatives and figuring out, you save $1,000 here and $50 there and how that adds up.
Yeah. I would say too, we were saying about the proposals for on my side and Jessica's, you have to be really careful about how you quantify how you're going to spend your time. So I find myself, saying up to 3 meetings or, 2 design revisions and quantifying so that if it gets really out of hand, you can go back to that document that they signed and say, we said it was going to be no more than 3 meetings. I don't mind that we did 1 extra, but we're at 10. So I'm going to have to charge you hourly for those, or, you make sure there's language to cover that.
Always charge for everything, because we're building bridges with new customers, and people don't like getting change order after change order, especially when they're small items. What we might do is keep a tally. If it's 1 extra, whatever, and the cost impact is small, it's almost not even worth the paperwork to write the change order and chase it, especially with a general contractor. But if that starts adding up, now it becomes worthwhile. But if you're doing something for somebody, just let them know you're giving it away. Because if you're trying to build a relationship and build a bridge, you want people to, be mindful that you're doing something for them that doesn't cost them anything extra.
Yeah. Great question.
So I think we have to wrap up, but I just wanted to thank you all. If we could just thank Jessica, Kyle, and Kayte. That was amazing. I learned so much.
Yay. This was fun. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your class.
Yeah. It's letting us take more of your time, but it was really fun. So we appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, thanks, guys.
All right,
We'll be in
bye,
touch
guys.
with, additional SCGD info too, just in case you want to become a member.
Perfect.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye.
Right,
Take
bye-bye.
care.